Hello and welcome to my first video where we'll be unwrapping and texturing this model using Blender and Photoshop. Enjoy! So I'm starting by unwrapping every part of the gun. I've modeled it, making sure I have several parts that are easy to unwrap. I'm also cleaning the mesh, you'll see in a minute, where I delete basically all the faces that are not going to be shown once the model is textured. So here I am doing that on the Canon. I'm adding a loop cut so I can hide those faces, delete them. Wasn't too sure how to unwrap this, but in the end I found out by detaching the tip of the Canon. It works out well. Here I'm doing the scope. This one is a bit tricky as well, but since it's mostly a cylinder, it's fine. I actually had some trouble with this part because during the modeling process I must have made a mistake, as some vertices were kind of close together but not exactly. You'll see on the UV where I have very small faces. It took me a minute to figure it out. And at the end I just used the remove double vertices instead of deleting the faces because they were hard to see. And I've just changed the threshold, so I was able to just remove those close vertices. And since the model is very low poly, it didn't change the rest of my topology. So that wouldn't have worked on a model with a lot of bevels and stuff like that and loop cuts. Yeah, I just went back to the Canon and detached the tip. So the Canon lay flat on the UV, the cylinder part, and kind of vertical. That will help when texturing. Had a bug when exporting the UV, so I did the exact same thing again and it worked. And you will see throughout the whole video all the problems I had with 2.8, and I had quite a lot when texture painting. So most of them can be fixed by just going back from texture painting mode to edit mode or any other mode and going back to it. So it took me a while to find a good wood texture for the handle and the Canon, I mean the part below the Canon, and found this texture which actually is really great. I'm really glad I found it. I will make a lot of change to the texture, adding some highlights and shadows by hand later on in the video. And at this moment I realized I forgot to scale my UV island according to the scale of each part of the gun in 3D space. So I should have done that before exporting my UV, and you'll see me scale each part as it should be, and for that I'm using a texture kind of with square patterns. You can find that on Google Image by typing texture for UV unwrapping or something like that. Very useful. So I'm making sure that each part of the gun has the same kind of space on the texture based on how big it is. So now I start texturing in Photoshop using this wood texture. And as you can see, in the original texture, there was a halo kind of effect, vignette I should call it. So the center part is lighter than the borders, but it actually looked kind of good on the gun. So I'm tweaking the wood texture now because I've applied it on two parts of the gun and I don't want it to look to be the same color. So I'm going back and forth between Photoshop and Blender doing that. Here I'm using a texture I think I found on Polygon. It's sitting on in my texture folder, so it's been here for a while. But what's good about this texture, it has a roughness and metalness already made. So I'm gonna be able to use this in my with the PBR node inside Blender to give some great result. With this kind of low poly model, you could only use a diffuse layer and paint on that. That's actually usually what most people would do, but I thought I would try a quite light PBR workflow and see if it looks good, and I was actually pretty happy with the results, so I'm gonna keep doing that in the future. So now I think this is my roughness map. So basically, the lighter something is, the more rough it is. So the less, so the light is reflected more in a more blurry manner. So I was making sure the metal part was not too rough compared to the wood. Now, if you don't remember which UV island is what, it's very easy in Blender to select a polygon in the UV, and it will reflect on your model if you have an option turned on called it's like 2 arrows that says skip UV and edit mesh selection in sync. So here I've basically made the 3 groups in Photoshop. One for the metalness, one for the roughness, and one for the diffuse. And I keep tweaking them in Photoshop and exporting as PNG and refreshing the texture inside Blender to see how it looks. So I'm trying to get a good idea of what my reflections and roughness and metalness will be. So now I'm not worrying about details at all. I'm just making sure like colors and textures worked well together, and later on I will start drawing details to make the texture more lively and interesting. So you see me doing this here. I was selecting polygons in the UV map in Blender and it was reflecting on the model, so I just wanted to make sure I knew which part I had to texture in Photoshop. So you see me isolating the metal part of the scope. I'm just doing that with a selection in Photoshop. It's not the most accurate, but no one will ever notice such a small difference. So same as the wood, for the cannon I've used the same texture but made it lighter basically, so it doesn't look like exactly the same metal was used. And for all the accessories on the gun, such as the blade and the metal parts on the scope, I've used another shade of the texture. So here I'm looking for a glass texture for the scope, but I can't find any that I like, so I use a grunge texture, and you'll see what I do. And now I'm importing a bamboo texture for the scope. I don't know, I just felt it would be cool rather than having a normal, usual wood. I think bamboo worked well for the scope based on how it looked. And now I'm just cleaning all my layers and group in Photoshop, because at this stage it's getting quite messy and complicated. So here again with the selection mask, I'm just going to keep the dirt on the next to the borders on the circle, which is, by the way, the length of the scope. And now I'm in the roughness texture and making the scope a low roughness value, so it's all shiny, kind of like glass, reflective, I should say. Now I'm just making a transmission texture where everything is black but the scope. So to get a reflection on the scope, right? As you can see, it's reflecting the HDR now. So it looks pretty realistic. Here I just try to have a smooth shading on the gun, just for fun, because it's obviously way too low poly for it to work. I'm just trying to figure out how the reflections are looking right now, and I'm still not going into detail as of yet. Now I'm creating a new texture inside Blender called Details. So that's basically, it's kind of like a layers in Photoshop, and I'm adding a mix RGB node set on either multiply or screen. I'm gonna use multiply if I want to do shadows, and screen mode if I want to do highlights. But I run into problems, and I think it's just Blender 2.8 being buggy. So I ended up having to make my shadows and highlights directly on the texture. It does work, but when you're painting, you cannot see the blending mode. So I mean, you can see it, but not really. It's weird. You don't get like the final output. So you're painting on a texture that doesn't look like what your texture will actually look like once the blending mode is active. So it's very weird, and it shouldn't work like that. Hopefully it's not gonna work like that once the final version of 2.8 is out. So here you see me joining several parts of the gun together, just to make my texture painting easier. What I'm doing here is adding highlights on the border, and I'm turning off symmetry to do those scratches. And because it's a bit hard to paint in 3D when doing this, especially on this gun, I'm using the 2D mode to paint those. At this point, I'm just really experimenting with the software and see what I can do and cannot do. And I've added RGB curve node, so I can tweak how the brightness and contrast of the texture. And here I'm finally adding some highlight to the texture itself, and that's just gonna make a very, very big difference to the final look of the image. And I really like doing that, starting from a real texture and giving it a hand-painted feel without starting from scratch, which is very time-consuming and a lot of work. And I'm just not good enough of a painter to achieve a very good result if I was to do that. So this is great for me. And I'm adding some more shadows to the texture after the highlights. And to do that, I am in multiply mode, so you're not erasing all the details you've previously achieved. You're basically darkening what's below the brush rather than painting pure black. So as you can see on the node setup, I'm just having my diffuse and details texture, which is also a diffuse, connected together with a mixer RGB node set up on multiply or screen, depending on what I'm doing, or add as well, if I just want to paint on top of my diffuse texture without altering it. And all this is going into the diffuse input, or the color input, into the PBR node. So here I'm hiding the seams of the texture, because that's a lot easier to do in Blender than it is in Photoshop. And looking back at it, I think the tip that we can see here, the square, the texture should have been rotated 90 degrees, should have been horizontal, but it doesn't make a massive difference. So I'm adding some cracks, and as you can see, it's pretty simple. I'm just adding shadows and highlights. That's all there is to it, really. I don't know why when painting in 3D you get this very it's very pixelated sometimes, your strokes, and sometimes it's not, and I'm not sure why. But when it is, make sure you blur it out. So I'm working on the blade now. And because the metalness and roughness texture are very important on the blade, a lot more than on the wood, I'm gonna make sure I paint details on those textures as well. And here I had a lot of trouble with Blender 2.8. Just sometimes everything is selected like it should be, and you're painting and just painting on the wrong texture, or it doesn't paint at all, and it's really frustrating, but just keep calm. And usually what fixes it is by turning things on and off back again, so changing mode, changing which texture you're painting and going back to it usually fix it. So now I'm making the inside of the cannon black, because having it just metal like that looks very weird. And what I just did here is using a warp under the edit menu to make the texture curvy. And it's just powder depot, I guess, that I'm trying to make. It took me a while to figure out how to do it, and I kept redoing it until it looked right. I've tried another texture that didn't work, came back to the first one, and eventually I worked it out. And using warp again, very useful when you're doing this kind of curvy texturing. And here I'm just using some pre-made brush I found online. I'm sorry, I forgot where, with the eraser tool. And I'm importing that in Photoshop, and as it's often the case, I forgot to turn off the UV layout layer I have in Photoshop, so the wireframe, sorry, end up being applied as a texture on the model. And here I'm adding a little bit more scratches to my metal parts. So here I realize that unfortunately all my previous end painting work in Blender has been lost. That's the first time it happens to me. I've heard it happening to a lot of people, because you have to remember to save your image in Blender every time you make a change before you go back to Photoshop, and I forgot to do that, so that's my bad. That's not a software mistake. And yeah, I just thought I would keep it in the video since you know, it can happen to you, so make sure you save your textures every time you do major changes to them. So I'm just gonna probably speed up the time lapse here because we've already seen this. I'm just doing the same thing again. And here I ended up going to Photoshop because Blender just didn't want to work with me and didn't want to texture paint. So I had to restart it a couple of times, and yeah, doing it in Photoshop was actually way faster and probably looked better as well because you have more control on your brushes and you can do just more stuff faster. So here I thought I would add some kind of carving to the bamboo, letting the user know how much the scope is zoomed in, so 10 times. It's just I like this nice little touch of storytelling, and the text I'm adding is because this is a weapon based off the game World of Warcraft, vanilla version. As you may know, they are redoing it. It's called Classic, and I'm making a scene about that. This prop is going to be in the scene. So as you can see, I'm trying again the technique of having a mix RGB nodes with a mode of add or screen or multiply, and as you can see the texture is fully white. So it's like I'm trying to paint some ambient occlusion and I cannot see the final result. Oh, here is something interesting just happened because I had my mesh intersecting together between two objects. It was really hard to paint in the interstice. So next time I model something like that, I'll make sure there is no intersecting mesh, and I'll make sure to boolean them together. That being said, looking at it now, I think there is a way to change how the paint is projected in 3D that allow to fix that, and I tried to find it in Blender 2.8, but I couldn't. To be honest, I haven't searched for very long, so if you know what it is, please leave a comment telling me. So I ended up taking back the ambient occlusion texture in Photoshop just to blur it, because apparently there is no blurring node in Blender for texturing, from what I've found at least. And here I'm using the line stroke type, and I'm basically doing some highlights again. I don't even know if I ended up keeping that, just because it was so buggy. As you can see, sometimes I'm painting and nothing is happening, and it's really not my fault. It's the software. But again, I don't want for you to think I'm complaining. It's the first version of the beta of 2.8. Of course, it's gonna be full of bugs. And I have to redo the blade as well because I've lost it, which is cool because I've ended up adding more details than the first time. And this was the second day working on this, so I was my mind was more fresh, I guess. I'm painting on the roughness, so making the tip less rough because, you know, it's used and should be more shiny. Here I had this weird shading. I'm not sure what caused that. If it was, you know, in the texture or just how it rendered. And I guess it was just how it rendered because in the final model I didn't see any trouble here. And as you could see here, how the wood texture turned out. I'm very happy about that. It looks great. If you were to do something more realistic, you wouldn't obviously have this much contrast and exaggeration in the scratches, but because my model is very cartoonish and I'm going for a semi-realistic slash cartoonish style, yeah, it turned out great. And finally, I had enough, so I'm working on the rendering that you see in the thumbnail. I'm just choosing an HDRI. I have an old pack of HDRI from Korea Studio, I think it's called, when I was working in Cinema 4D before switching to Blender a while back. So I'm using one of them, of their HDRI. I've considered doing the render fully in Eevee, but ended up switching to Cycle. And just placing it again, and I forgot I had made this feather way back when I was modeling it, so you'll see me adding that in a minute. So here I actually had to look it up how to rotate an HDRI in Blender. I forgot that you have to add a mapping node and a texture coordinates, and that was the same in 279, I believe. And here I'm adding some backlight to it, so like the edges looks a bit better, and I'm also adding another point light in the front, just because I like to use my HDRI as complementary lighting and do the lighting myself for the most part. I think it looks way better than only using an HDRI, usually. So yeah, here I realized I had my feather standing around for the whole part. I forgot to attach them and parent them to the gun, so I'm doing that. Also make them smaller than they were before. I really like this bloom effect on Eevee, it's very cool. and the feathers were very dark compared to the rest of the models. So I boosted them a little bit, and same for the blade, adding a vignette effect with a selection, tweaking the colors of the gun. And here I'm adding brightness to the blade, because it didn't look right to me. And obviously in game it wouldn't look like that, but I like to go the extra miles for my renders, just so I can have a nice image to show. And you know, I like this stage. It's like you're done, basically. You're just adding some extra power to your model. And it's very fast and fun. So I wanted to add an outline to the gun, but I never really do that. That's only for the thumbnail of the YouTube video. So I actually had to figure out how to do that. And here I'm adding some grainy texture just to add some variation. And I think I ended up only applying the colorful texture you saw to the gun, not the background, just to add a little bit of variation. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you thought of the video in the comment. And I just thought I would show you the wireframe of the rifle before we end up the video. And probably next time I will show you how to model not this gun, but my next prop with the same style. Thank you for watching.